All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so very much for joining us for this exciting panel on DC Statehood. Uh, I am sitting here in the district that should be a state right now, and I am really excited to be sitting and joined with three dynamic experts who have been leading the vanguard, the fight on this issue from different vantage points in respective organizations for many years. And so I tip my proverbial hat off to them, but even before we begin, as an honorific, because to be in the space where people have dedicated their lives and made significant sacrifices to ensure that we all enjoy the full rights and representation that this country long allegedly aspired us to have. I'm honored to be with each and every one of you. I'm Ravi Perry. I'm a member of DC on the board there, and I am a professor of political science at Howard University. I am excited to be a member of the board of DC Vote, who has been fighting since before most people, since the last century, for statehood, for congressional representation for DC, and they have been in the vanguard fighting for these issues in so many ways you might think about that we don't necessarily remember, having paid for polling to get the information out about what the public thinks as it relates to DC statehood, and so many other issues, working on and off the Hill very hard each and every day to ensure that this issue becomes an issue similar to, like I would say, like freedom to marry, where we want eventually the organization to go away because statehood has achieved itself. And so that would mean that certain organizations would no longer exist because we've got what we've existed for. And so really honored to represent DC Vote today in this powerful panel here with Netroots. I'm going to take a few moments to just shed a quick light on kind of where we are on statehood, and then I'm going to introduce all of the panelists. As you may know already, just this week, if you do not feel as though you had enough gumption or to really care about this issue, it was affirmed just this week by the United States Supreme Court that DC does not have the right of congressional representation. And so we are here today to continue to fan the flame of representation and justice for the 700,000 plus people who live here in this federal district. And it should be important to point out that the issue of statehood as a movement really has been going on. Some could argue even before the 20th century, but really picked up steam in the 50s to the 70s as civil rights efforts really led to the 23rd Amendment in 1961, which finally granted the District of Columbia Electoral College proportional representation. And that, of course, gave DC finally a voice in presidential elections. And that has been the case since 1964. And over the course of the late 60s and the 70s, there were several bills in Congress to try to address congressional representation. And they made it out of committee in the late 60s and early 70s a couple times, went to a floor vote in 76. And in 78, it resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Amendment that expired, however, in 85 and did not get ratifications that it needed to go beyond that. Fast forward to the early 90s, we saw again a bill to grant statehood to the district introduced in Congress, but it was not brought up for a vote. And following a 2012 referendum in terms of Puerto Rico, people began to really invest in the statehood movement in DC, I think, with renewed energy. Former President Obama became the second president to support statehood in 2014. And where we are today, more than 20 years after that 93 vote, there's been um, no congressional hearings on statehood, but on the U.S. Senate committee has in fact done some hearings on related aspects of the bills. And what we saw recently, of course, with the DC Admission Act, in that we introduced by Senator Carper earlier this year as S51, a bill to provide admission to the state of Washington, D.C. and to the Union, has a record 38 or 39, I think, co-sponsors in the Senate. And of course, our own Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, who has led the fight on statehood, certainly since the 90s, if not before, was the key instrumental voice in moving the statehood vote through the House of Representatives and got it to the desk of the Senate, where we are still fighting the battle to get it achieved. And so here we are today, and we have the great leadership of three amazing panelists to join us. And I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to invite us to move forward. Honored to be joined by Council Member Janice Lewis George, who is a Ward 4 native and a member of the DC Council for Ward 4, and is the third generation Washingtonian. And she is also a proud, of course, graduate of DC public schools and has been, in terms of a lot of advocacy and activism, been working on the front lines of Black representation issues in the district for her entire life. We also are joined today by Barbara Arnwine, the president and the founder of the Transformative Justice Coalition, which is an international, of course, organization that has been fighting for critical justice issues, including landmark Civil Rights Act of the 90s, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act 15 years ago. And she's also a legal law lecturer and the board vice chair of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, among so many other amazing accomplishments. And we have with us the Venerable Cliff Albright, co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund. And they have been literally in and out and around all of the states and here in DC. I feel like I've seen Cliff at least 10 times in the past couple of weeks, bringing what is known as the Blackest Bus in America to voters throughout the country to get folks increase their awareness on this issue. So I'm excited to be joined by all of them. Welcome to each of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Council Member Lewis George, if you don't mind introducing yourself, saying a little bit more about yourself and discussing statehood and how it affects you as a member of this council here in the District of Columbia.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm so honored to be on this amazing panel. As you stated, I'm a DC native, so I was born into taxation without representation. And I've been advocating for DC statehood since I was in high school. And I can tell you that in a very different place, we are in a very different place than we were then. Back then, I think DC statehood felt like a distant dream. And as strongly as we felt about it, we were really struggling to be heard. And I'll say this, I was a political science major at St. John's University, and I wrote my thesis on DC statehood. And most of my classmates were shocked. And my professor told me she learned so much by reading the thesis. So that's really how far we've come since then. It's only recently that the incredible, tireless organizing that grassroots DC residents have done for decades is really bearing its fruit. We've been able to win over hearts and minds on DC statehood, not only through persistent advocacy and relationship building, but also by mobilizing and by being loud and making ourselves inconvenient for decision makers, whether they have an R next to their name or a D. One of the efforts I worked on the DC Statehood committee of our local Democratic Party was an initiative called No Donation Without Representation, which was based on the idea that DC residents are historically active in politics, and we donate to campaigns, and we canvass, and we do all these other things. We shouldn't be doing that if someone's not committed to that work. I spent my career in criminal justice, having been a district attorney in Philadelphia in the Attorney General's office, and coming back here working in the DC Attorney General's office really just reinvigorated already my passion, because as many know, DC has one of the highest rates of mass incarceration in the country. And this is largely because the federal government controls many parts of our criminal justice system, including our courts, deciding when DC residents get probation, our parole system, our laws on marijuana, and more. And so these are unelected federal officials who aren't accountable to our DC communities. And that's concerning and harmful when we are set at the whim of the values of a constantly changing federal administration, which, too often takes a staunch law and order approach. And that's not the criminal justice approach that we believe in, but it's what was forced on us as a result of the lack of statehood. And so the district's own Frederick Douglass, who we will name our new state after, taught us, that power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. And so where we are now is because people held protests, because people got arrested, because people wrote theses and made a point to say, we're not going to go away until we get full equality. And now that, as I step into this role as a council member for the District of Columbia, this fight has just become even more important as we have to have Congress over us every time we go to pass a law. And even most recently, as we were impacted by the pandemic of not being able to get the vaccine distribution that we asked for because we were a territory. So this issue is alive and well, and I'm excited to take this on and to be on this panel to talk some more about it.
Thank you so much, Councilwoman. And Cliff Albright, you mind sharing us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, hey, thank you so much, Dr. Perry. So glad to be here and with this great panel. I've got an interesting story and an interesting connection to DC Statehood movement. I actually I'm not originally from DC. I'm not a DC native, Washingtonian. I'm originally from New York, but I moved to DC back in '95. I lived in DC for 3 years. That's when I first got introduced to this notion of DC statehood. Before that, being in New York, it wasn't something that we thought about. But as soon as I heard it, having come there and said, wait a minute, no tax. I read somewhere that somebody fought a whole war over no taxation without representation, and yet here we are living right in it, like right now. And so I immediately, got attracted to the movement, and I agree completely with the councilwoman that at that time it seemed very distant. It seemed like something that nobody else knew about, that there was very little support in Congress. So to see that a way that it's moved from there to where we are now is truly amazing. It's really a testament to the amazing work of folks in DC, activists in DC over the years. I'm proud that, like, one of my contributions and our organization's contributions, as some people may know, we're thick in the middle of a battle over voting rights and trying to pass voting rights legislation. And back in June, my organization, Black Voters Matter, came together with some incredible folks like Barbara Arnwine and Transformative Justice Coalition and a whole bunch of other organizations, with labor like Unite Here, who was a huge supporter. And we came together for something called the Freedom Ride, where we went around to 10 different states, including the state of the Douglas Commonwealth. We went around to 10 different states, and we delivered this message of, one, trying to get people to be involved in the battle for voting rights, but two, trying to educate people about the voting rights legislation that was pending then. At that time, it was the For the People Act. Now it's been shifted to the Freedom to Vote Act, but it was the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and it was HR 51, DC admissions. And I remember our call. Barbara may remember it, where we were talking about, like, the agenda and everything. And we said, well, you know what, we can't go to DC for a freedom ride that's about voting rights and not address DC itself. And too often that's what happens. You got all kinds of people and issues and causes coming to DC, but while they're in DC, ignoring the elephant in the room. That DC, the lack of DC statehood and DC voting rights is perhaps one of the oldest forms of voter suppression in this country. The 700,000 residents who, as you just said, Dr. Perry, do not have full voting rights and congressional representation. It's a travesty, right? And so we were pleased to include DC statehood as one of the core issues there. And at the time, I think the Washington Post said it was the first national rally which took place on the culmination of the Freedom Ride. I don't know if it was the first, but it was certainly one of a few where it was a national, where DC activists didn't have to stand alone, rallying amongst themselves with, a handful of folks. This was like a national rally. And again, I got to give it up for Unite Here. They came through 1,500,000 members strong from states all across the country, labor showing up, making the demand for DC statehood. And so it was a beautiful event, but it's just one of many that we've been doing. Now there's not an action that takes place. Just this week, just 2 days ago, I was actually arrested at the White House along with four other folks at an action that was sponsored by the League of Women Voters and People for the American Way. But it was very much supported by folks from DC Vote and other aspects of the DC statehood movement who were there, who are always making the demands. And I really got to give it up. They always show up whenever there's something taking place demanding voting rights. DC statehood folks are there, even when they don't fully get recognized. They show up because they know how important this issue of voting rights are. But we've been trying to be consistent that every time we talk about the Freedom to Vote Act and every time we talk about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that we be sure to mention HR 51 and S51 and DC statehood. And so we're pleased to be in this struggle with you for voting rights writ large and specifically in this battle for DC statehood and DC voting rights.
Thanks, Cliff, for repping DC so hard. I'm also not a native, but I will damn sure rep DC as hard as I can. We've got 800,000 people here that are Americans that deserve every single right every other person gets in this country. Barbara, you mind introducing us, telling us your beautiful story?
Well, thank you so much. And what an exciting panel this is to be part of. I am just so grateful for all the activists who have been fighting all over the country, but fighting hard here in DC for DC statehood. People get it confused. DC statehood is just not about the residents of the District of Columbia. It's about all of us. If you want racial justice, then you want DC to be a state. If you believe in representative government, then you want DC to be a state. Think about this, that if DC were a state, we wouldn't be scratching our heads, running left and right, trying to get Manchin and Sinema to do the right thing regarding a filibuster. The Senate would not look the way it does. It would be more people who would be in the Senate. And think about it. The one thing we really desperately need in the United States is a progressive state, a state that has no qualms about the fact that it's here to fight for racial justice for all Americans. There are some great states out there, but none has the identity that the District of Columbia would have as a predominantly African-American state that would be committed to progressive legislation. We know what it would look like because we know what the initiatives would look like that the people of DC have voted for. So when I think about it, everything in the US looks differently. Remember, we're a Republican form of government. That means that we're based on the theory that every person who is a voter has the right to try to choose a representative of their choice. That means that you got to have a state government that's going to be reflective of that opportunity to elect your senators, your representatives. We don't have that. DC, they call it a territory. We know what it is. It's a colony. And we got to get away from all these stuck, ancient, anachronistic perceptions of colonialization. That belongs way back in the 18th century. It does not have any place in the 21st century. So we have a right to fight for it. I am personally a native-born Californian, and I've traveled and lived all over this country with God's blessings. But being in DC, since being here, living in this area and dealing with these issues and working downtown DC for over, oh my goodness, for more than 30 plus years, I know how wrong it is to deny people the rights that we would see. I just want to end on this note. When Evanston, Illinois passed reparations, everybody lost their mind. That was a city, folks. Think if that had been the state of DC, the Commonwealth of, the Douglas Commonwealth. Think about that. The reverberations just from that little city doing what it did has already forced 18 other cities to think differently about their role in fighting for reparations. Imagine what we could do if the district was a full state. So I don't want us to ever, underestimate the value to the entire nation of having a progressive state, having a Douglas Commonwealth. The name itself, raising up the amazing Frederick Douglass. Remember, Frederick Douglass was the man who said, when people were, talking about slavery, that he's the man who said slavery can only end in blood, right? And people thought he was crazy, but he was being prophetic. And one day I prophesied that we are so close, folks. We're going to see DC statehood. We're going to see it in our lifetimes. We're going to see it real soon. This is not some pipe dream. This is a reality that's coming into birth, that's coming into its own being. We're going to have an amazing celebration soon, and this nation will never be the same once we have DC statehood. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone, for those passionate reflections on your own commitment to justice on this issue, but also your plea to everyone else to have that same commitment wherever they may be. And so I'm excited to begin with some questions. I'm going to start with you, council member, if that's okay. I know that this is your first term on council. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the idea of congressional oversight. And can you help people who may not be from DC understand what congressional oversight looks like? How does that play into your decision-making about legislation that you want to pursue or programs that you wish to pass?
Yeah, so something that surprises people is that when we pass legislation and pass our budget in DC, it has to first go through congressional approval. And so that means Congress has the ability to block what we do as legislators. And when they don't block it, there is still a significant delay because we have to go through this process. And so that can be a big deal when we need to address really urgent issues. And this is historical. I mean, it impacts us so much. A powerful example of how this hurts us is in the 1990s, Congress added a rider to the budget banning DC from using its local funds for a needle exchange programs. And after the ban was lifted in 2007, DC implemented a needle exchange program, and the number of HIV cases attributed to drug injections actually dropped astronomically. We went from 150 cases in 2007 to 2 cases in 2019. And this was a program proven to save lives, and we couldn't implement it solely because of our lack of statehood. We've also seen this issue with Congress blocking our ability to decriminalize marijuana, protect immigrant rights, reform our criminal justice system, and so many other issues that affect the daily lives of our residents. DC statehood and our lack of statehood isn't just jeopardizing DC's ability. It's jeopardizing our ability to protect the lives of our residents. And I want to say, even though I am new in the council, early on when I took office during the pandemic, I saw how much DC's lack of statehood can impact something as basic and as important as our residents' health. We saw this clearly with DC's vaccine distribution. The federal government initially didn't give us enough vaccines for our healthcare workers, and then refused to vaccinate federal workers who live in our region, and even denied our request to place a mass vaccination site in our city, even though we had a population that met the requirements. And so that wouldn't have happened if we had statehood and 2 votes in the U.S. Senate as leverage. And, no state, would have to have been disrespected and undermined in this way.
Wow, thank you so very much for making it clear. I'm initially a scholar of urban politics and local politics. I've written books on cities, and there's no city council county government system like there is here in the District of Columbia. It's like a state, a county, a state board of education, a city council, all in one. I don't know how y'all do it, but hats off to you for the work. Cliff, I was hoping you could help us. I know you chatted about a little bit in your introduction about how you were good to see you back in outside of a jail cell, and I know you talked about as well the relationship between some of the voting rights organizations pushing for all of these various bills, and how the statehood message and how DC Vote and other orgs who have been pushing this have been left out in some ways of many of those efforts by many of those orgs. But that had been changed, and it's a teamwork, and it's working, and people are all together and have been for months now. Can you help explain to people in ways I know that only you can, what is the relationship really between race, voter suppression, voting rights, and statehood? What's the relationship?
Well, I think if you think about it as Venn diagrams, as Venn circles, then I think you got like a perfect overlap of the forces for voter suppression, the forces against voting rights, and the forces that are also against DC statehood. Obviously it's got a racial justice piece to it, right? Because DC, again, we've said it earlier, would become the first Black plurality state, in the country. So it's got a racial justice aspect to it. It's got a voting and a voting rights aspect to it. But it's also about governance. It's about it's about the control. I mean, think about we're very familiar with cities that are trapped in within so-called red states. All right, I live in Atlanta, where recently there was a very public battle between the mayor of Atlanta and the governor over mask mandates and stay-at-home mandates and things of that nature. You've got cities within states like that. Think of someplace like Houston or Dallas that's within Texas, and the battles that go on there. And DC faces all of that, but it has to deal with the federal government, right? Which is an even bigger. And even when it's under democratic rule, you still got just the fact that you've got all these hands involved in DC's home rule that shouldn't be involved. So you got a racial justice aspect, you got a voter suppression aspect to it, and again, it's some of the same forces, political forces, corporate forces that are against Black folks in general, whether that's voting rights or fighting against police violence, whatever it is. All those forces are also in perfect alignment with the forces that are fighting back against DC. But but you've also got other interests. Quite frankly, you probably got some other state interests, right? Even though DC, unlike some other states, some other red states, would actually contribute more to the federal government than some of these other states that wind up taking more out, right? And so I've made the argument that in fact, we're having these discussions around budget reconciliation, right, and infrastructure, and what can be included in the budget reconciliation package. I've made the argument. I mean, HR 51 and S 51, those are standalone. But the truth is, whether or not DC is a state, that's got budgetary consequences. So why can't we fight to have DC admissions included in budget reconciliations? If we're going to fight for immigration to be included, which it should be, I support doing that, right? But if we're going to do that, then why we can't also pull in DC statehood into reconciliation? If we got all this other stuff with infrastructure and all the rest of it, why we can't? You think DC statehood isn't going to impact the budget and in a positive way? So so finding ways to constantly try to insert this issue, even in places that some other folks don't want to see it inserted and don't think it should be inserted. Whether that's inserting it in the voting rights discussion, or inserting it in the budget reconciliation discussion, inserting it in the COVID discussion, whatever it is, we need to constantly raise this issue, because the more that we raise it unapologetically, the more that we raise it, what is the argument that you can have against it? Like, there is no common sense argument on why you would have an entire 700,000, 800,000 people who have no representation, who don't have full voting rights. You can't give a sane argument against it. There just aren't enough people in this country that are even aware of it or that see it connected to their interests. And the last thing I'm going to say is I agree 100% with what Barbara said. We wouldn't be in this situation. Think of how much we'd be able to move. Not just voting rights, not just infrastructure, reproductive justice, Medicaid, healthcare, right? Think about all the issues that right now we're not at living wage, all the issues that we can't even have a discussion around or get past because we got some feckless folks that are supposed to be representing democratic values, but they're not fully doing it. Like Barbara said, we shouldn't have to be chasing Manchin around on his yacht. Talking about some entitlement. He don't want to create an entitlement society. Dude, you live on a yacht and you got the nerve to talk about an entitlement society. We wouldn't have to have that discussion with him if we had two senators from a progressive Black plurality state of DC. So it's in all of our interests. It's the right thing to do, to be clear. But on top of it being the right thing to do, it's in everybody's own self-interest. If you believe in freedom and progressive values, then it's in your own self-interest that we fight for DC statehood. So I hope that answers your question, Doc.
Absolutely. No, I should have been recording so I can use that in class. I'm gonna Barbara, I got a similar question for you. I know that Cliff mentioned that y'all are on this freedom ride throughout the South here to DC, and I was, when I used to work in Mississippi State, I was honored to host the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, and brought some of the original ride to the state of Mississippi. And I know how significant the Southern contingent of support is for justice movements. But as we've discussed, if you don't live in DC, the same passion. And so I'm curious, what was the reaction from folks on that trip as it related to the advocacy for statehood for DC? Did people see a connection between, as Cliff was saying, between racial issues and voting and what's happening here?
What I find is that, one, people aren't aware of the issue, who have not, studied it and have not had it brought to them. We got to be some of the best ambassadors of making sure people know this issue. And then they always get confused because they've heard all the negative stuff, right? They say, well, DC is too small to be a state. And then you bring out the facts to them about the fact that there are 2 states existing that has less population than the District of Columbia. Then you bring out the fact that DC residents pay more in Texas than 20 states, just the people. How the heck do you say that there's no justification? And when you hit people with that facts, they go like, whoa, because they haven't thought about it. And then when you start talking about racial justice, what it would look like to have a DC, Douglas Commonwealth in the Senate, a Douglas Commonwealth in the House, how that changes the entirety of the way that the fight for racial justice, especially for African Americans, not just for African Americans, but how that changes the outlook. Because all of a sudden people have to listen. They have to weigh what the representatives, what those senators say. And those senators aren't going to be quiet when it comes to issues. Will we be sitting here having the stupid debate about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act if we had Black senators from DC, or we had DC representatives? Because I'm telling you, Black or white, they're going to have to represent our interests. It would be different, and we wouldn't have this Tim Scott delay tactic and all the nonsense that has happened to basically take that really critical piece of legislation, which I think doesn't go far enough to begin with, but still to take it totally off the table, to allow this, rampant police killing of Black folks to just keep happening in this country. And we know that police actually kill Native Americans more than they kill Blacks proportionally. These kinds of engagements should be happening now. This entire battle over our democracy, this entire, all these 400 vicious voter suppression bills, these 19 states that have passed 31 vicious voter suppression laws, all of this is happening because of the change of our demographics. But one of the worst suppression methods is the lack of statehood for DC, because it denies this whole entire government, the entirety of the United States, a real picture of what real representation for all of us could look like. And I know one thing, if we had a Douglas Commonwealth, do you think folks wouldn't be voting more and differently and more actively in Mississippi? Do you think that folks would be sitting back in North Carolina? I'm telling you, this entirety of a justice envisioned America is dependent upon, absolutely dependent upon, DC statehood.
Wow, thank you so much, Barbara. That both you and Cliff both addressed, I think, not only a question that I have, but one of the audience questions also asked the role of racism in DC's disenfranchisement. And so appreciate you tackling that. And for Councilwoman, as someone who is HIV positive every day, I certainly appreciate your lifting up that community and how statehood has contributed to the prolonged illness and the increasing number of deaths of those folks, many of whom were native Washingtonians, and who we lost tens of thousands of through that horrible epidemic. And I think these examples are so powerful because they remind people that lives are impacted by the lack of representation here in the District of Columbia. It's not just a policy matter. We're actually talking about lives and how lives can change and how the system can perhaps change as a result of that. And so, Council Member, I've got another question to shoot toward you. And can you talk about the folks who don't live in DC? Because we all know that it's going to require all of us together to make statehood happen. What can people who don't live in DC do to help the statehood movement?
Well, the first thing you can do is actually call on your senators, call on your congresspeople to join the movement for DC statehood. Our warrior on the Hill, Eleanor Holmes Norton, has continuously worked to get more individuals, absolutely deserves a round of applause, has continuously worked to get more people to sign on to DC statehood. And every year she adds more names, more congressional names to that list of individuals willing to support statehood. But that's not going to be enough. We need senators on board. And so what we need is individuals to run for Senate. One thing I'm going to put up here, there is no Black woman in the Senate at this current moment. So want to say that with Vice President ascending to Vice President, we don't have a Black woman in the Senate, but we need more senators willing to support DC statehood, or we're not going to get over this hump. So we need individuals to, one, run for Senate who support DC statehood, to pledge no donation without representation. So not supporting any candidates unless they're pledging to support DC statehood. We need your help in getting that word out, and adding your vote and your voice to that to that decision for DC statehood. And I think it's critical for not only just getting the word out. We need you to right now take DC statehood very seriously, because I think, as Cliff said, we're at a moment, and I think Cliff's powerful words reminded me to emphasize the point that statehood for DC is an essential component part of any voting rights legislation worth passing. And it would be absurd and shameful to pass legislation to expand voting rights and democracy, and democracy that leaves 700,000 plus people, a plurality of them Black, disenfranchised individuals, without making sure that we are a part of any voting rights legislation. So I'm asking individuals to take up the mount now, as you're fighting for voting rights legislation, to ensure that DC is an essential component of voting rights legislation. And I think those are all the ways that we can have solidarity and support. And like you said, these are issues affecting everyone's lives. Real people live in the district. I was born and raised here in the district, and I want people to understand that every decision you make has an impact on our lives. We talked about it through the pandemic. We talked about the AIDS crisis. We talked about in the criminal justice system, right? A federal criminal justice system is running our how we do address crime here in the district. So if you care about criminal justice, if you care about health rights, if you care about wanting to see equality, really, you have to care about DC voting rights. It has to be a part of the conversation. And so I implore people to make it a part of the conversation, not just when we have the opportunity to bring it up through another legislation, but right now with the voting rights legislation we're trying to pass.
Thank you so much. Y'all are doing my work for me as a political scientist here, encouraging folks to know who your state reps are, know who your state senators are, not just your U.S. senators. If you don't know your state reps and state senators, then you are missing out on your representation. You need to figure out who your zoning board member is, your school board member is, your city council member is, and you need to contact them and tell them what your interests are, and keep doing it until the change happens that you want to see.
Ravi, I want to add one thing. We got to take care of this filibuster. I want to make sure I make this point about the filibuster, because it's truly our greatest obstacle to DC statehood. All year we have begged Democrats to do what they promised to do when they were running for office. We heard from Joe Manchins and Chris Cinemas of the world about how sacred the filibuster is, and that it can't be changed no matter what. And when it was time to pass voting rights in DC statehood, they stood by the filibuster. When it was time to pass immigration reform, they said there was nothing they could do. When it was time to pass police accountability and police reform laws, nothing happened because of the filibuster. But this week, as we're dealing with the debt ceiling issue, and suddenly banks and corporations started worrying about their profits, then suddenly people started making exceptions to the filibuster. So much so that Senator McConnell, has backed down. So we need to see that kind of energy with DC statehood when it comes to and with voting rights. And I just wanted to say that, because I was just so taken aback by this sudden willingness to make exceptions to the filibuster when that wasn't there for DC statehood and hasn't been there for voting rights.
And and that's why whenever we talk, and people say, let's pass the Freedom to Vote Act, let's pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We say, let's pass DC Statehood. We do not, we can't allow people to wedge and separate these issues because they are intricately intertwined. And as a Black woman, who believes so strongly in, African American women empowerment, I find it sickening that, we don't have a Black woman in the Senate. I find it sickening, as has been pointed out by Bo and others, that we don't have we never have had in this nation a Black woman governor. Never, anywhere. Yep. So when we talk about intersectionality of race and gender, just to start there, not to mention all the other intersectional points, it is so critical for us to understand what it would mean to have that voice. I love me some Eleanor Holmes Norton. Oh my gosh. I mean, she is for me, everything, because I know that how she helped Fannie Lou Hamer. Yeah. And where would we be without Fannie's amazing legacy to this nation? Yeah. I think about how she's been constant and persistent and so creative. Think about if she were the governor. Think about what that would mean to this nation. I'm telling you, our entire body politic changes its entire face when we have DC statehood. That's why they're so afraid of it. Yeah. They understand what we're talking about. But the reality is that you can't fight the wind. Change is inevitable. The DC statehood is not a pipe dream, it's an inevitability. It will come, and we need it sooner than later. So as soon as every time I speak, even before Congress, every time I speak, I'm saying to people in the DNC, RNC, I don't care. I say to the president, to the vice president, to everybody, talk DC statehood. Be serious about DC statehood. Make it a priority. Move it now. Don't have it in the background as something that you think is unachievable. Racial justice is not, quote, unachievable. It's inevitable. It's required. It's mandatory. And only vicious voter suppression can stop it. And that's what the denial of DC statehood is. It's voter suppression.
I wanted to, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead, Cliff.
I'm sorry, just real quick, because there was a piece of the question about the history of racism and racial justice that I forgot to mention. I was doing some research on some history a little while ago and came across some of the colored people's conventions, right? The conventions that free black folks used to have in the middle 1800s. And I came across one, and one of the platform issues that they addressed was the call for voting rights of their brethren in the district. And so there has always been this connection between racial justice and voting rights and black folks in particular in the District of Columbia. And so I just wanted to point that out, that this is some very old history that we're dealing with, both in terms of the opposition to those voting rights and to that statehood, but most importantly, but the flip side is we're standing in some mighty footsteps about how long our folks have been organizing, even as we were trying to deal with the larger issue of slavery and issues all across the country, that we've always seen our destiny attached to our brothers and sisters in DC. And so this is some major history that we're in right now, and we're in a critical moment where if we give the last push, if we spread the word enough, if we raise enough funds, if we support our friends right there in DC, we can get across what is it that it's never been at this point of having had a hearing and having passed in the House and having had a hearing in the Senate. We have literally never been at this point before, even just in the terms of the specific legislative history That's how close we are. We just got to give it this final push.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And Ravi, can I add one more thing to the intersection of racism and DC statehood? And that is, and I will suggest a book by one of my constituents, Derek Musgrove, Chocolate City, where he breaks this down through Reconstruction and how DC, the disenfranchisement was a choice for many, and that choice was based on the fact that at the time DC was a predominantly, it still is, but it was as it was back then. We were known as Chocolate City. It was a majority Black city, Black leaders, Black leadership. And it's my firm belief that if DC were a predominantly white state, this issue would have been addressed decades ago. And that's just the facts on that.
So I really appreciate
it. If I can add one other take on this also, Cliff, on the conventions, the colored people conventions are so powerful. Your point's well taken. Also note that the Black women, the colored women's conventions were held, 1896 in DC, after the big Boston convention in 1895, that they were all the subsequent conventions for the next decade almost were all held in DC, and Black women were powerfully talking about making sure that we had, representation, and at that time, of course, the right to vote, period, for women. But it is such an important part of this that there is, all this unclaimed, unknown history that we need to keep, raising up, just like you did with the Colored People's Convention. But the Colored Women's Conventions are powerful. And people have just lost all that history. Harriet Tubman was the keynote speaker at the Black women, the Colored Women's Convention in Boston. We have no copy of her speech, but she was the keynote speaker. So, so we gotta, and she lived in DC, and so many stories there about her interaction with this fight for DC statehood. Thank you.
I really appreciate you making all those points. And I want to dovetail, and I have to step away for an unexpected call shortly. But I'm going to dovetail my last question that I had for y'all. And it's about race, but it's the flip side of it. I appreciate all y'all answering this question. What can white folks do to help support the statehood movement? And whoever wants to go first.
Well,
a whole lot. I mean, it's just true. Like we've all been talking about, and the, Councilwoman just made the point so strongly that if DC were white, we wouldn't be having this battle. And white allies, progressive allies who understand the need for America to transition from this racially unjust society that it is to a racially just society should understand how critical it is for us to have DC statehood. And also those who see themselves as progressives should certainly understand what it would mean to have a DC statehood, and those leaders leading the way in our Congress and our Senate, in our House and in our Senate, what a difference that would make. Also, just think about it. If we had a real attorney general who represented the Commonwealth, the Douglas Commonwealth, think about all of the other implications there are if you have a serious state. Also, I think that part of, the DC could be a wealthier state than many, because of the predatory nature of its relationship to all these other places that come in and wear down their roads and do all the other things. No other city allows that to happen. No other state allows that to happen. Let's be honest, folks, that there would be a difference of reality here, economically and in policy-wise, and the representation. So there is the need for whites to realize that this is their struggle. It's not a Black struggle. This is our struggle for these times.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, I think, I would say, to white allies, elevate Black voices, elevate DC Native voices. Yes, I need you to understand how this issue impacts you, because it does. But most importantly, I need you to center how this impacts Black people systemically, and the degree of racism, prejudice, and suppression that we've had to endure to get to this point. And finally, I need white allies to join us in fighting like hell to make sure that we are the final generation of DC residents that don't have full equality or full representation.
Amen.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. There's some upcoming actions that folks can get connected to. There's actually a whole relay that's about to take place from October 19th to October 23rd, going from West Virginia. Y'all know why we're gonna be in West Virginia, right? We're gonna be going from West Virginia through Harper's Ferry, coming down through Maryland and into DC. And on the day before, I think it's on the 22nd, that there's going to be, as they're crossing the line coming from Maryland into DC, there's going to be an action that's really going to be focused on statehood. And it's also going to be a big part in the culminating rally that's going to take place on the 23rd. So you can get more information about this, freedomtovoterelay.org, freedomtovoterelay.org. You can get information there on the days and the itinerary and all that. But DC Statehood is going to be a major part. It's all about voting rights and the pending legislation, but DC Statehood is an important part, as we've all said, of that battle, including statehood into pending legislation. So that's one way that all folks can get involved, but white folks, no matter where you are, can get involved in that. Also, if you're in a state, and I don't know the 12 states or senators that have not yet, I'm assuming 12, because I'm assuming that the 38 that have co-sponsored the Senate bill are all Democrats, right? That's just a state of objective reality, right? And so, but if it's only 38, then that means we're missing 12 Democrats. So if you're in a state where your senators have not yet co-sponsored that bill, then you need to be reaching out to them today. That's a very easy way that you could get involved. If they got a flood of phone calls,
or run against them.
That's right. Or run against them. That's right.
Oh,
and so
that's right.
if they're getting a flood of calls and text messages from folks, then they'll even be shocked. They'll be like, oh my God, I didn't know so many of my constituents even knew about this DC thing. And so that's a very easy way that people can get involved, and follow the organizations that are in this fight, right? Follow organizations like DC Vote. Twitter handle is DC_vote. Follow council member Louis George and see what she's talking about and the issues that they're dealing with. Follow Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton. Follow the folks that are in this 51. There's a whole 51 for 51 campaign. Follow the groups that are doing the work, and support them, right? Don't just, it's like we say about trust Black women, right? Don't just trust Black women, support Black women, right? Same thing with DC Statehood. Don't just trust and be aware of DC Statehood, support DC Statehood, support these organizations, invest in them. If you've got media connections, use your communications and media connections to tell this story so that more people in this country, there are people that are actively against this issue, but I swear there are people who are absolutely clueless about this issue. And we've just got to let more people know consistently about this. So those are just some ways: freedomtovoterelay.org, DC Vote, Councilwoman Louis George, following folks, and take some action.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Bo Schuff. I'm the executive director of DC Vote. I'm stepping in because Dr. Perry had to step out. I'm going to play the ghost in the machine here and just be a voice. I just wanted to thank our panelists and thank all of the attendees. This has been fascinating, even for me who lives this issue on a daily basis. I thank you guys so much for bringing these voices to this panel and to this effort, and all of your work as well. I look forward to working with all of you going on. Thanks again to all of the attendees. Everybody have a great afternoon, and join us as we make the 51st state.
That's it. Douglas Commonwealth.
Thank
you.
Thank you so much. Can't wait.